Right now, somewhere in your city, someone is having a breakdown. Maybe it's a neighbor, maybe it's someone on the street. And the first thing most of us feel, even before sympathy, is a flicker of something else. Unease, distance, a quiet instinct to look away. We've built entire systems to manage that discomfort. Hospitals, diagnoses, medications, institutions, we've medicalized the question. But here's what nobody asks. Before any of that existed, before the hospitals and the labels and the pills, when a member of a small band of 30 or 40 humans began hearing voices, began acting in ways no one could explain, began losing contact with the world everyone else shared, what happened to them? The answer reaches back further than civilization, and it changes everything we think we know about madness, about compassion, and about what it actually means to be human. Let's start with a skeleton. In a cave in northern Iraq, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a man who had been dead for roughly 46,000 years. His name, he had one, is gone. But his bones told a story that stopped researchers cold. He had a withered arm, a missing hand. He was blind in one eye. These were not injuries he had just sustained. The bone structure showed years of adaptation, years of the body compensating, years of living with conditions that, in the ancient world, should have been a death sentence. He couldn't hunt. He couldn't gather. He couldn't fight. By every rule of survival that we assume governed prehistoric life, he should have been abandoned. He wasn't. Someone fed him. Someone protected him. Someone kept him alive, not for a week, not for a season, for years. This is the oldest known act of deliberate human care. And it wasn't in a civilization. It wasn't in a culture with laws or religion or a moral philosophy. It was a small band of prehistoric humans who looked at someone who couldn't contribute and decided he was still worth keeping. But that raises a harder question. Physical disability is one thing. A broken body is still a familiar mind. You can look at a man with one arm and recognize him. You can understand what he needs. But what about the ones whose minds broke? What happened when the person who was lost wasn't lost physically, but mentally? When someone in your group of 40 people began hearing voices that no one else could hear, seeing things that weren't there, speaking in ways that made no sense to anyone around them. For a long time, scientists assumed the answer was simple. They died. Ancient life was brutal and efficient. There was no room for passengers. Anyone who couldn't pull their weight was a liability, and liabilities were abandoned. That was the theory. Logical, cold, clean, and almost certainly wrong, because the bones keep telling a different story. 100,000 years ago, researchers found the remains of a woman in what is now Morocco. Her skeleton showed evidence of a condition that would have caused significant cognitive impairment, intellectual disability, behavioral differences that would have been visible and obvious to everyone around her. She could not have survived alone. She didn't have to. She lived into adulthood, cared for across years by people who had every practical reason to leave her behind and didn't. In Atapuerca, Spain, 430,000 years ago, researchers found a young individual with craniosynostosis, a condition where the skull fuses too early. It causes developmental difficulties, neurological differences, cognitive disruption. This person survived well past the age where their difference would have been apparent, not hidden, not secret, known and chosen anyway. These cases are not exceptions. They are a pattern. Across hundreds of thousands of years, across every continent where we've dug carefully enough, we find the same thing. People who should not have survived, who did, because someone else made a choice. The oldest human behavior we have archaeological evidence for is not war. It is not religion. It is not art. It is care for someone who couldn't care for themselves. But physical and cognitive disability still leave the person recognizable. What ancient humans faced with mental illness was something far stranger, something that would have been terrifying to witness and completely impossible to explain. Think about what it would look like. A member of your group, someone you've known your whole life, begins to change. They stop sleeping. They start speaking to people who aren't there. They describe visions that no one else can see. They behave in ways that are completely disconnected from the shared reality of everyone around them. You don't have a framework for this. You don't have a word for schizophrenia. You don't have a concept of brain chemistry or neurotransmitters or psychotic episodes. You just have a person you love who has become someone you no longer recognize. So what do you call it? Almost universally, across every ancient culture ever studied by anthropologists, the answer was the same. You call it supernatural. You decide that what is happening to this person is not a malfunction of the brain, but a connection to something beyond ordinary reality. The voices they hear are real voices, voices from the spirit world, from ancestors, from forces that normal human perception can't access. The visions are messages. The disconnection from ordinary life is not a breakdown. It is a doorway. This was not a comforting lie. Ancient people genuinely believed it, and it had profound consequences for how the mentally ill were treated, because if the voices are real and the visions are messages, then the person experiencing them is not broken. They are chosen. They are the one the spirits decided to speak through. They are the most important person in the group. That person became the shaman. The word shaman comes from the Tungus languages of Siberia. But the concept is one of the most universal things in all of human culture. Every continent, every civilization, every isolated society that anthropologists have ever studied has some version of it. A figure who stands at the boundary between the ordinary world and the spirit world. Who can communicate with forces that normal people cannot perceive. Who heals, who mediates, who travels between the living and the dead. And researchers have noted for decades that the psychological profile of the shaman overlaps significantly with what we would today diagnose as serious mental illness. The visions, the voices, the episodes of dissociation, the altered states. What we call symptoms, they called a calling. This is not a small observation. In 2015, researchers published a study in the journal Schizophrenia Research comparing how people experienced psychosis in different cultures. They interviewed patients in Ghana, Vietnam, and the United States, people who were all experiencing what clinicians would classify as the same condition, the same brain, the same illness. But the experience was completely different. In Ghana and Vietnam, many patients described the voices they heard as familiar, sometimes helpful, sometimes the voice of an ancestor, sometimes the voice of something sacred. It was frightening, yes, but it was not meaningless. There was a framework. In the United States, the voices were almost universally experienced as hostile, random, threatening, and completely without meaning. Same illness, completely different inner experience. Because the story a culture tells about madness changes what madness feels like from the inside. Ancient cultures told a story that gave the experience a purpose. That placed the person experiencing it inside a framework where they were not broken, but significant. And that story may have shaped the very nature of what those people suffered. But history is never only one thing. Not every ancient culture responded to mental illness with reverence. In many cultures, madness was not a doorway but a contamination, not a gift from the spirits but a possession by something malevolent. And the response was not elevation but fear, containment, ritual violence in the name of healing. Trepanation is one of the oldest known surgical procedures, holes drilled through the living skull. We find evidence of it on every continent, going back at least 10,000 years, and possibly much further. Some researchers believe it was performed to release whatever was trapped inside a suffering mind, to let the evil out. The procedure was agonizing. It was performed without anesthesia. And yet, here is the thing that stops you cold. Many of those skulls show healed bone around the hole. The patient survived. The bone regrew. Which means someone didn't just drill and leave. Someone stayed. Someone changed the dressing. Someone watched through the night. Someone kept them alive through a recovery that must have been brutal. Because even when the response to madness was violent and wrong and born of terror, it was still a response that included someone staying. The impulse to care and the impulse to contain have always existed together. That tension is not a modern invention. It is woven into the entire history of how human beings have treated each other when the mind breaks. Move forward in time and the story becomes both better and worse, often at the same time. Ancient Egypt had written records of what we would recognize as psychiatric illness. The Ebers Papyrus, written around 1550 BCE, describes states of overwhelming despair and mental confusion. And it recommends treatment, not exile, not execution, treatment, structured care. Something approaching what we might today call therapy. A priest sitting with the patient, listening, offering a framework for understanding what was happening. In ancient Greece, Hippocrates made a claim that was radical for its time and remains important now. Mental illness, he argued, was not caused by demons or spirits. It was caused by the brain. He was correct, 2,500 years before the tools existed to prove it. He described depression. He described mania. He described conditions that read unmistakably like what we now classify as psychotic disorders. And he insisted they were medical problems requiring medical solutions. Rest, structure, attention to the physical body. He was the first person in recorded history to look at someone experiencing psychosis and say this person is not possessed, this person is sick. And sick people can be treated, but Hippocrates was not the mainstream. The mainstream in Greece still believed in divine madness. Plato wrote that madness sent by the gods was more valuable than the sanity of ordinary men. The oracle at Delphi, whose pronouncements shaped the decisions of the most powerful rulers in the ancient world, was almost certainly in an altered state, breathing volcanic gases rising through cracks in the earth beneath the temple. What we would today call a psychotic episode was considered the most sacred thing in Greece. The same condition, two completely different frameworks, both existing at the same time. In 705 CE, in Baghdad, the first dedicated psychiatric hospital in the world was established, not in Europe. In the Islamic world, at a time when European medicine had largely retreated into superstition, Islamic physicians were classifying mental illnesses, distinguishing between different types of psychosis, debating causes, developing treatments. Al-Razi, one of the greatest physicians of the medieval world, argued that mental illness was a disease of the brain, not the soul. He was saying in the 9th century what Hippocrates had said 400 years before him, and what too many people in between had forgotten. Europe had its own institutions. Bethlem Royal Hospital in London, which became infamous under its corrupted name, Bedlam, a word that entered the English language as a synonym for chaos itself. For much of its history, Bethlem charged admission. People paid to walk through the wards and watch the patients, not to heal them, to watch them. The suffering of the mentally ill became entertainment, spectacle, proof that whatever you were struggling with, you were still better off than that. It would take reformers whose names are not famous enough. Philippe Pinel in France, who struck the chains from patients and argued for moral treatment. Dorothea Dix in America, who documented the horrific conditions in which the mentally ill were held and forced legislative change. William Tuke in England, who built the York Retreat on the radical premise that the mentally ill deserved dignity. These were not doctors who discovered new treatments. They were people who looked at what was being done in the name of care and refused to accept it. We have not solved this. Not yet. Not even close. Mental health care remains underfunded in almost every country on Earth. The stigma is still there, still shaping who gets help and who doesn't, still whispering in the background when someone admits they are not okay. We still debate where the line is between treatment and control. We still struggle with the tension between care and containment that has existed since someone first drilled a hole in a living skull and then sat up through the night to watch over whoever survived it. But here's what 46,000 years of evidence actually shows. Long before there was a word for mental illness, long before there was a hospital or a diagnosis or a theory about what the brain does when it breaks, long before any of the frameworks humans would eventually build to explain what madness was or where it came from, there was a person who couldn't function in the ordinary world, and there was a community that didn't let them disappear, that man in the Iraqi cave. We don't know his name. We don't know what his community believed about what was wrong with him. We just know that he lived longer than he should have because someone decided he was still worth staying for. That is not civilization. That is something older than civilization. It is the thing civilization was eventually built on top of. The question that ancient humans faced when someone went crazy was never really a practical question. It was a moral one. Is this person still one of us? Does what has happened to their mind change what they are? Are we the kind of group that stays? And across 300,000 years, in caves and camps and ancient cities and medieval monasteries and the first hospitals ever built, the answer that kept emerging, imperfect, inconsistent, sometimes brutal, sometimes beautiful, was the same. Yes, we stay.